Whether you like a shiny love bracelet or wear one of the house's Eau de Parfum, chances are that you know or have come across the name Cartier. Cartier's a big name in fashion and jewelry, but like every other top gun in the industry, it didn't start big. In fact, Cartier wasn't into jewelry and fashion until much later in the company's history. Interestingly, Cartier's history is rooted in one man and his set of skills in the age-old craft of watchmaking. So, how did this venture that started as a one-man watchmaking store grow to become Cartier, the luxury brand? In this video, we'll weave our way through the story of how a turbulent 19th century Paris and its uprisings, a timely expansion, and the purchase of a cursed diamond led to one of the biggest jewelry brands in the world. This is the untold story of Cartier. The story begins in 19th century Paris when a young, ambitious Frenchman, Louis-François Cartier, started as a watchmaking apprentice under the master watchmaker, Adolphe Picard. You see, Picard ran a small watch shop alongside other small businesses like restaurants, cafes, and fish shops on Rue Montorgueil. So when young Louis-François Cartier joined him, the goal was just to get trained in the old art of watchmaking. However, the trajectory of things will change when the servant becomes the master. There isn't much detail about what transpired, but from what we know, after serving his time as an apprentice, Cartier took over his master's store. Thus, he laid the foundation for his own business. However, remember that at this point, the store wasn't any bigger than the small storefront that Adolphe Picard ran when he was still an apprentice. So the venture was still modest by every standard, and didn't in any way look like anything other than an avenue for the young master to practice his craft. But what Cartier didn't know was that the political air in Paris was heavy and the clouds of change were pregnant with the coming political turmoil. Turmoil that would change his life and business in ways he never imagined. So, how did the Paris political landscape shape the early days of Cartier? The seeds of the Cartier brand were sown a few years after Louis-François Cartier took over his master's business. This started with his idea of expanding the store's operations from just timepieces to building a jewelry collection. So he scouted for the finest jewelry around France and elsewhere. However, the budding jewelry business hit its first rough patch. The cloud of political uncertainty in Paris was full, and an uprising swept through the country in 1848. You see, for centuries, the rich in France and much of Europe had built fortunes off the backs of the poor peasants, and the uprising was just the peasants saying enough to all the plundering. Meanwhile, the uprising threw Paris into great economic chaos, and as a result, people were struggling to survive. So with people struggling to feed themselves, and some even going as far as eating rats to survive, what would become of jewel dealers like Cartier? Well, it was a tough time for Cartier in the business, but somehow he managed to survive the hardship. From this point on, there was no stopping Louis-François Cartier. So, for the next couple of decades, he ran the business and managed to grow modestly. Meanwhile, during this period of modest business growth, the Cartier family also experienced numerical growth. In other words, Louis-François Cartier had a son, Alfred, who was old enough to join the family business. Alfred's youthfulness and his ambition were a great addition to the family business. He was more business-oriented than his father and had the grand dream of making the business far bigger than what his father ever imagined. However, it was neither his business acumen nor his big ambition that placed the business on the path to achieving this larger-than-life dream. Although those would play a role in the future of the company, it was an unforeseen circumstance that doubled their growth rate and essentially put them on the map. So what was this unforeseen circumstance, and how did it shape Cartier's future under a new heir? The 19th century was a crazy period in French history. In 1870, 22 years after the first uprising that nearly put Louis-François Cartier out of business, France was rocked yet again with another uprising. This time, it was a socialist revolution known as the Paris Commune. What was the Paris Commune, and how did it affect Cartier's business? As I said, the Paris Commune was a socialist revolution, so essentially a new government seized power and waged a bloody war against the French aristocracy. They believed the old money elites were the reason behind the country's failures, and the only way out was to exterminate them and confiscate their wealth. So, with their wealth restricted, the fleeing elites turned to every other asset they could lay their hands on to raise enough money. And since, for the most part, their wealth was locked in jewelry, they had to sell them off. The distress of Paris aristocrats presented Alfred and the business he had just inherited an opportunity that comes just once in a lifetime. Without hesitation, Alfred jumped at the offer and made himself the go-to guy for any elite who wanted to trade his jewelry for money. As a result, he built a larger collection of jewelry than his father, and this time, it was not just any kind of jewelry, but luxury jewelry from rich socialites, which he got at a bargain. So although the Paris Commune ended in a matter of months, it laid the foundation for the success of the Cartier brand. You see, before the uprising, Alfred and Cartier had a small collection of jewelry, but by the end of those few months, their collection had grown to include more expensive pieces of jewelry and earned a name as one of the finest jewelry collections in all of France. So, by the end of the Paris Commune, France had become a republic. People were once again free to spend money, and most importantly, Alfred was now free to market his new collection to those who could afford it. Although the Cartier brand sold jewelry before the uprising, this change in fortune cemented its position as a jewelry brand. For the next 20 years, Cartier didn't just get requests for timepieces, but also for bespoke jewelry. This period was marked by a lot of movement. Alfred moved the business to several locations, but in 1899, he finally settled on the Rue de la Paix. This final location coincided with the turn of a new century and a new phase for the Cartier brand. How did Cartier adjust to the new century and the new phase of its business? We'll answer these questions in the next section of this video. But before then, if you've enjoyed this video, stop at this point and smash the like button to prove your love. Okay, so the 20th century was a great time for Paris. The city was coming alive, and there was competition in the jewelry business because most of the jewelry houses you know today began to thrive during this period. As a result, Cartier faced fiercer competition than it had faced before that time. Alfred had a reputation for being an astute businessman. So what was his response to the competitive market and the new phase of business? He responded in two ways that forever changed the Paris jewelry industry and the world in general. First was his move to Rue de la Paix. Then, in addition to this move, Alfred did his homework in the elite class of Paris. As a result, he not only caught the attention of the rich and noble French, but also many of the world's royal houses. Over time, these moves became the classic playbook of French jewelry companies. The result of this is that Rue de la Paix became the single most important jewelry area in Paris, and by extension, in the world. So with France comfortably in the bag, Alfred set his sights on conquering territories in other major cities outside France. But what was his game plan? At this point, Alfred Cartier's three sons, Louis, Pierre, and Jacques, were old enough to join the family business. So first, he brought his three sons and their unique skills into the family business. However, unlike other instances where such moves ended in chaos, this one was quite successful. Although all three made their mark on the company, Louis was undoubtedly the leader of the pack, and his influence led Cartier to its golden era. Cartier under Louis had one focus: perfection. Louis was so strict in his pursuit of perfection that if any piece failed to meet his standards, it never saw the light of day. Bear in mind that other jewelry houses at the time probably had strict measures to maintain quality, but Louis's obsession with perfection set Cartier apart from the rest. It was this obsession with quality and perfection that fueled the drive to take the company beyond the shores of France. At least Louis Cartier knew that the Cartier brand could sell in any part of the world without concern for quality. Beyond creating top-quality jewelry, Cartier took two gambles that cemented its influence in the industry. The first was Louis's idea to change the way men used timepieces. You see, before this time, timepieces for men were mostly pocket watches, but Louis Cartier had another idea. The idea of moving timepieces from the pocket to where they were more visible. The goal was to move beyond just functionality and to make timekeeping a fashionable thing. Thus, Cartier designed the first wristwatch under the careful supervision of Louis Cartier. Before long, wristwatches took the market by storm, and as such, Louis's dream of timepieces being both functional and a fashion statement became reality. Beyond the introduction of wristwatches, Louis also left another mark in the jewelry industry. At this point, most of the jewelry on the market was either silver or the more expensive gold, but Louis introduced yet another metal that was lighter and stronger than the popular gold and silver. Under Louis, Cartier created a special hard platinum used in setting jewelry. And like the first gamble with wristwatches, the market accepted the platinum jewelry. thus cementing Cartier's place as a leading brand in the industry. With this strong footing in the market, the next logical step was to take the brand beyond the shores of France, and that is what Cartier did. Europe's economy took a big hit in the 1900s. Just after the First World War, businesses were still struggling with the effects of the war, but on the other side of the Atlantic, the New World was experiencing an economic boom. The economic growth in the United States between the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century was big enough to catch the attention of an astute businessman, one of the three Cartier brothers, Pierre Cartier. While Louis focused on creating masterpieces, Pierre had an eye for expansion. So, following their initial expansion to London, in 1917, Pierre set his sights on New York, where he started quite small as a little-known jeweler in a Fifth Avenue townhouse. But suddenly, this status changed, and Cartier was on the front page of every US newspaper. How did Pierre achieve this sudden rise to prominence? You see, Pierre's story and Cartier's rise to prominence in the US would be incomplete without talking about a purchase that would go down as perhaps the most notorious in the company's history. A purchase involving the world's most valuable blue diamond with a very dark backstory, the Hope Diamond. Sometime between 1910 and 1911, soon after opening a shop in New York, Pierre Cartier made an ambitious purchase. He bought the Hope Diamond, which was considered the most valuable blue diamond in the world. But behind this jewel of inestimable value was a very dark past that had some truth to it, but in reality was another way to keep the peace in the public space. Word on the street was that the Hope Diamond was cursed because the previous owners of the piece died most horribly, from beheading to being a feast for wild dogs. So anyone who bought this expensive jewelry instantly became the talk of the town and appeared on the cover of almost every newspaper. The dark past was good publicity, and that was what Pierre had in mind when he bought the Hope Diamond. Although Cartier had no plans to keep Hope and sold it almost immediately after purchase, the link to the brand's name gave Cartier much-needed publicity. Before Hope, Cartier was just a small French jewelry store in New York, but after Hope, the Cartier brand was at the top of the US jewelry industry. However, several events would define the operation of the company both at home and overseas. The first was the Great Depression in the US. Unlike other companies, Cartier rode out the Great Depression by expanding into the jewelry market in the Far East. But despite this success, tragedy struck the Cartier family in 1942. Louis and Jacques would die within months of each other, aged 67 and 58 respectively. This meant that the responsibility of running the company fell on Pierre, the only surviving one of the three brothers and their children. However, upon Pierre's death in 1964, the family unanimously agreed to sell each branch of the company separately, thus ending the brand's connection with the family. In 1972, a French consortium led by Robert Hawke, a hero of the French resistance during World War II, repurchased most of the Cartier branches, but Hawke did not live long to see the expansion. He died 7 years later in a tragic automobile accident. Following his death, his daughter took over the company, and this was followed by other successors until 2012, when it became a subsidiary of the Swiss Richemont Group. In the end, a venture that started with just one watchmaker grew into a multinational company. Not too bad for a French apprentice watchmaker.